A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Mark. One of the scribes came to Jesus and asked him, "Which is the first of all the commandments?" Jesus replied, "The first is this, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is Lord alone. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. The second is this, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no commandment greater than these." The scribe said to him, "Well said, teacher. You are right in saying, He is one, and there is no other than He. And to love Him with all your heart, with all your understanding, with all your strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself is worth more than all burnt offerings and sacrifices." And when Jesus saw that he answered with understanding, he said to him, "You are not far from the kingdom of God." And no one dared to ask him any more questions. The Gospel of the Lord. Recently, I looked at a map of the state of Kentucky that had an unusual feature. I went to the web page at the Diocese of Lexington, and they had a tab called Find a Parish. And I clicked on the tab, and there I saw the Diocese of Lexington within our state, and I saw all the churches of the diocese depicted as little bubbles with crosses inside them showing where the churches were. And so I saw a cluster of bubbles around Lexington and one around Danville and Frankfort. But if you go to the south and the east into Appalachia, you see these little bubbles, the points of light, if you will, in all the little towns and communities throughout Appalachia. It's kind of reassuring to see. And I remember when I was little, that wasn't the case. First of all, this area was at that time part of the Diocese of Covington. Lexington didn't exist back then. But the churches themselves didn't exist, and there were pretty much no Catholics in the region. And it reminded me of the one man who, more than any other, was responsible for bringing about the change to what we see today. And of course, this is Father Ralph Biding. Now, Father Biding is a product of Campbell County, and he grew up here, and he attended Newport Catholic High School, and he went over to St. Gregory Seminary, and he was ordained at the Cathedral Basilica of the Assumption in Covington in 1949. And for the first year of his ministry, he served as an associate pastor at St. Bernard Parish in Dayton. But then in 1950, the Bishop of Covington, Bishop Malloy, called him in, and Bishop Malloy wanted him to establish a new parish centered in Berea. Well, the parish was going to be of 4 counties in size, the size of the state of Rhode Island. And at the time, there were very few Catholics in the region, and they purchased an old rundown house for Father Biding to live in. But other than that, he was pretty much on his own. And so, not quite knowing how he was going to bring about a parish in this region, he went down there, and he ended up staying for 31 years. And then he was transferred over to the Big Sandy Valley in the very eastern part of Kentucky, and he served around there for the rest of his life, another 31 years, until he passed away in 2012. And at the time of his death, he had built 20 churches, 20 of these little churches that I see on the Diocese of Lexington map nowadays. And he established summer camps, and his little service project called the Christian Appalachian Project had grown and had a budget of $90 million and was serving people all through Appalachia. And I wondered, how on earth did he do this? How did he bring about this change? And fortunately, Father Biding left a good deal of documentation about how he was able to do this. He wrote a number of books, these little paperback books, and he gave a number of interviews, some of which you can find online. And so I listened to the interviews and I checked some books out of the library. And there's 3 things that I came up with that he used to bring about the change. The first was that he would always preach the gospel. And we think about preaching the gospel in church. Of course, Father Biding did that, but he also went out into the different towns, to the street corners, to the shopping malls, and he would preach on the streets. And I can imagine how much courage that must have taken, because this region had a lot of anti-Catholic hostility back then. And the second thing he did was he met the needs of the Appalachian people. He wrote about how shocked he was that how poor these people were. So they had large families living in a single room with no electricity and no plumbing. And of course, a lot of times the families went hungry and they didn't have sufficient clothing. And so he would make weekly trips up here to northern Kentucky to get supplies to donate to those people. And I remember my family was always thinking about what can we donate to Father Biding's clothing drive or food drive. And when he saw that the people needed more than simply material help, he established the Christian Appalachian Project in 1964 to bring skills and to bring hope to these people. And the third thing that Father Biding did was through personal encounter. He always would strive to win people over to himself and to God. Even if it meant that they wouldn't become Catholics, he was a great ecumenist. He worked with people of different faiths. And the striving to win people over extended not only to the people of Appalachia, but also to the volunteers who came to serve in the Christian Appalachian Project. They would get this notion that they were there to help the local people. And of course he would agree with that, but he always would strive to make them see that Christ is the center of their work. Without him, their work will be futile. And through his tenderness and compassion, he won over the children of Appalachia. We hear about the summer camps that he established, and within those books there's pictures of him ministering to these children, and you can see his tenderness and his care. But of course the most difficult was to win over the men and the women of Appalachia, because they had been brought up not liking Catholics. There was a lot of anti-Catholic sentiment. And there's a story that Father Biding would tell that epitomizes his yearning to win people over. And it took place in Jackson County, southeast of Berea. And at that time, the church owned some farmland. And they had been given some farm animals by the Trappists. And I guess they had a neighbor that didn't like Catholics. And one day, 2 cows got off of the church's land and wandered onto the neighbor's land. And he called the police and had Father Biding arrested on the charge that he maliciously released livestock onto the property of defenseless people. Well, Father Biding was brought into the county seat and he was tried that very same day. He didn't have a lawyer, and he was fined $60. And I guess in a couple of months later, the neighbor's barn burned down. Father Biding swears, "I had nothing to do with it." And afterward, Father Biding went to the neighbor and said, "I'm very sorry that your barn burned down. I know how much you need that for your cattle. And I have some lumber that I was planning on using to build a workshop. But since your barn burned down, I'm going to donate that lumber to you." And the neighbor said, "Well, you know what I've done to you, don't you?" And Father Biding said, "Yes, I know." And the neighbor said, "Well, why are you doing this?" And Father replied, "It's because what Christ told me to do, to love those who hurt you and to come to the aid of the needy." And the neighbor replied, "You sure don't know how to fight fair, do you?" And I guess Father Biding knew that he had won the man over. And so I think about Father Biding when I come to today's gospel. Christ gives us the 2 great commandments. You shall love the Lord your God with all your mind, with all your heart, with all your strength. And you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And of course, we are to love not only in our thoughts, but in our actions, in our lives. And I thought about the life of Father Biding, and I asked myself, is there something from his life that I can see that shows his love of God and love of neighbor that I can learn from? And thinking about Father Biding, I could see as a sign of his love of God more than anything else was his obedience. He first went to Appalachia upon the order of his bishop, who represented the authority of the church, but he writes in his books about the number of times he was discouraged, he felt overwhelmed, and he was thinking about putting in for a transfer. And he said every time he did that he would hear the voice of the Lord whispering in his ear, "You've got to stay, you've got to help these people. I don't have anyone else to care for them." And he would stay out of obedience to God. And so through my obedience to what I feel God is wanting me to do, I can show my love of the Lord. And it was out of obedience that Father Biding went forth and he loved his neighbor. And you can see this in the love that he showed towards that neighbor whose barn burned down. As he approached the neighbor, he did so not out of pride, but out of humility and patience and forgiveness. And it was through those virtues arising out of love of neighbor that he was able to win over the people of Appalachia. And so it's the same with me. If I can go forth and out of obedience to God show the love of my neighbor in my patience and my humility and my forgiveness, that I can win them over like he did. In 1993, Father Biding published an autobiography. It was entitled Called to the Mountains. And toward the end of the book, he wrote he had received a letter from a female parishioner that said, "I wanted to drop a note to the greatest romantic in the parish." And he was uneasy. He didn't know what to make of that note. And so the next time he saw her, he asked her what she meant by it. And she replied, "Oh, don't you know? A romantic is someone who is in love. And you're in love with so much that is around you that I think of you as a hopeless romantic." And he writes, "And the more I thought about the comment, the more comfortable I felt. I am a hopeless romantic." And so we can remind ourselves that through obedience to the two great commandments that we hear today, love of God, love of neighbor, that regardless of whether we are single or married or widowed or what, that we can become hopeless romantics in the image of this priest who came to serve the people of Appalachia with a love that could move mountains. Amen.